The story begins with an inventor named Brian who lives all alone in a remote house surrounded by hills. There are no neighbors, no visitors, just Brian and his endless inventions. He spends his days creating all sorts of strange and unique things to make his life easier. His house is filled with his homemade gadgets, each one a product of his imagination. One of his biggest inventions is a modified tricycle, which he has turned into a flying tricycle. To make it even more unusual, he attaches a large clock to it so that anyone riding it can simply look up and see the time. However, despite all his efforts, the tricycle never actually flies. He tests it, but the experiment fails. Still, Brian never gives up. He keeps inventing, even though most of his experiments don't work the way he hopes. One day, while returning home, Brian comes across a pile of junk on the side of the road. As he looks through the discarded items, he spots an old mannequin head. Something about it sparks an idea in his mind. What if he built a robot, a machine with artificial intelligence, something that could think and move on its own? Excited by the idea, Brian takes the mannequin head back to his workshop. Using all the tools and spare parts he has, he works tirelessly, piecing together a strange-looking robot with the mannequin's head. He wires it up, programs it, and does everything he can to bring it to life. But no matter how hard he tries, the robot won't activate. It just sits there, lifeless. Brian doesn't give up on his creation. He keeps working on it, trying different ways to get it to function. One morning, he decides to leave the robot on charge and heads to the shop to buy more tools. On his way, he meets a kind and cheerful girl named Hazel. She tells him about a big festival happening soon in the city. The festival is a tradition where people burn objects that hold bad memories, a symbolic way of letting go of the past. Brian listens with interest, but his mind is still occupied with his unfinished robot. After spending the whole day traveling and gathering supplies, Brian finally returns home late at night. As he steps inside, he notices storm clouds in the sky, and soon lightning flashes across the hills. Curious, he looks outside and is shocked by what he sees. The robot he built is moving. It stumbles around in the yard, frightened by the lightning flashing in the sky. Brian is overjoyed. His invention has come to life. It has fully activated. Without wasting a moment, he rushes outside, gently takes the robot's hand, and brings it inside the house. He can't believe it. After all his failed experiments, this one has finally worked. The next morning, Brian wakes up, eager to check on his creation. But when he looks around, the robot is nowhere to be found. Panic sets in as he searches every corner of the house, calling out for it. Just as he starts to worry, the robot walks back into the house. Brian stares in amazement. The robot is holding an English dictionary. Somehow, in just one night, it has learned the English language. It looks at Brian and speaks for the first time. Overwhelmed with excitement, Brian tells the robot, "I spent 72 hours building you." He explains how much effort and time he put into creating it. The robot's design is unique. Its torso is half made from an old washing machine. Seeing his creation fully awake and capable of speech, Brian decides to give it a name. "You will be called Charles," he says proudly. The robot pauses for a moment, then its face lights up with happiness. It likes the name. Brian takes Charles outside to show him around his property. As they walk, Charles notices some dark shapes on a tree. He gets scared, thinking something dangerous is there. But Brian reassures him, explaining that they are just birds and won't hurt him. Curious, Charles asks Brian, "Is this the whole world?" Brian shakes his head and says, "No, the world is much bigger than this, but you have to stay away from people. It's not safe for you out there." After that, Brian takes Charles back inside. That night, Brian falls asleep, but Charles stays awake. He keeps repeating, I am sleeping, all night long. The next morning, Brian tells Charles that he has to go out for a while to meet someone. Charles doesn't like the idea of staying home alone. He wants to go with Brian, but Brian insists that it's not the right time for him to go outside. Reluctantly, Brian leaves Charles alone and heads out to meet Hazel. They spend some time together before Brian finally returns home. As soon as he steps inside, Charles lights up with excitement. He is overjoyed to see Brian again. Charles loves drawing, and one day he makes a picture of himself, Brian, in the garden outside the house. It's clear that he enjoys being creative. He and Brian spend a lot of time together, having fun and enjoying each other's company. Their days are filled with laughter, and their bond grows stronger. At night, they have dinner together and then go to sleep. The next morning, while Brian is making breakfast, both of them start dancing, having a great time. But suddenly, there's a knock at the door. Hearing the sound, Charles starts mumbling nervously. Brian quickly tells him to stay quiet. He then goes to open the door and finds a man standing outside. It's the meter reader. The man explains that he's here to check the electricity meter. Brian tries to send him away, saying, "Can you come back later?" But the man insists, "If I come later, You'll have to pay extra. Realizing he has no choice, Brian lets him inside. As the man takes the meter reading, Brian glances at Charles, who is trying to stay hidden by placing his head close to his body, making himself look less noticeable. The man finishes checking the meter but then notices Charles. With a confused expression, he asks, "What is that?" Thinking quickly, Brian replies, "Oh, that? It's just a faulty washing machine." Satisfied with the answer, the man doesn't ask any further questions and leaves the house. Brian and Charles spend all their time together, playing, exploring the area around their house, and even having fun pillow fights at night. Their days are filled with laughter and mischief, making their bond even stronger. One evening, Brian turns on the TV, and a man is talking about a beautiful country. The screen shows stunning landscapes and fascinating places. Charles watches in amazement and excitedly says, "I want to go there too." Brian quickly changes the channel, hoping to distract Charles and keep his curiosity in check. He knows that Charles dreams of seeing the world, but he also knows the risks. If Charles goes out into the real world, he could be captured, taken to a lab for research, and separated from Brian forever. Brian can't let that happen. The next morning, Brian goes to the store to buy a few things. When he returns home, he notices something strange. Charles isn't inside the house. Panic sets in as Brian searches for him, calling his name. Finally, he steps into the backyard and finds Charles standing there, dressed in a bizarre outfit made from random items he found. Charles looks at Brian and firmly says, "I want to go to the city, the one I saw on TV yesterday." Brian sighs, realizing how much Charles wants to explore, but he also knows how dangerous it would be. Gently, he convinces Charles to come back inside. Charles, however, is upset. Even though he's a robot, he has real emotions, and right now he feels frustrated and disappointed. Wanting to make it up to him, Brian finally says, "Okay, I'll take you to the town." Hearing this, Charles's mood instantly brightens and he gets excited. He insists on sitting in the front seat of the car, but Brian tells him that he has to sit in the back. After some playful arguing, Brian gives in and lets Charles take the front seat. With excitement in the air, they set off on their little adventure, heading toward the town, where Charles will get his first glimpse of the world beyond their home. As they drive, Charles excitedly tells Brian that he wants to see the airport and a swimming pool. Brian sighs and explains, "There's no airport or pool around here." Charles looks a little disappointed, but Brian keeps driving. After a while, Brian spots a place and decides to stop the car. He tells Charles to stay inside while he quickly takes care of something. Charles waits patiently, but when Brian returns, he's shocked to see Hazel standing near the car, talking to Charles. Brian realizes that Hazel has now discovered his secret. Worried, he rushes over and quietly tells her, "You can't tell anyone about Charles." Hazel, surprised but understanding, promises to keep it a secret. With that settled, the three of them decide to go somewhere peaceful and drive to the bank of a large lake. As soon as they arrive, Charles is thrilled. He loves the open space and the fresh air. While Charles explores, Brian and Hazel walk together, enjoying each other's company. There's a growing connection between them, and Brian feels happy around her. But suddenly, they notice Charles walking towards the water. Panicked, Brian rushes over and stops him. "Charles, you can't go in the water. If you do, you'll short circuit," Brian warns. Charles listens and steps back, understanding the danger. Feeling more at ease, Brian, who is starting to really like Hazel, gathers the courage to ask, "Would you like to go out again sometime?" Hazel smiles and says, "Yes." As the three of them head back home, they run into Brian's nosy neighbor, Addie, along with his daughters. For a moment, Brian panics. They're dangerously close to discovering Charles, but somehow he manages to keep Charles hidden. Even though they avoided being caught this time, there's always a lingering fear that someone will eventually find out about Charles. The next day, Brian calls Hazel and excitedly tells her, "Let's go out for a walk today." Hazel agrees and comes to his house. But just as they are about to leave, Brian and Charles get into an argument. Charles is determined to see the whole world, but Brian doesn't want that. He knows it's dangerous for Charles to be out in the open. The argument grows tense, with Charles insisting on his freedom while Brian tries to protect him. In the middle of their argument, Brian's nosy neighbor, Addie, arrives with his two daughters. As soon as Addie lays eyes on Charles, he is impressed. Fascinated by the robot, he turns to Brian and says, "I want to buy your invention." Brian doesn't even hesitate. "No," he says firmly. Addie's face darkens with anger. He shoves Brian, making him fall to the ground. Then without another word, he storms off, furious that Brian refused to sell Charles. The next day, Brian visits Hazel at her house, hoping to clear his mind. But when he returns home, he's met with a terrible sight. His front door is broken. Panic rises in his chest as he rushes inside, calling out for Charles. But Charles is nowhere to be found. Worried and desperate, Brian looks toward Addie's house. That's when he sees something shocking. Addie's two daughters are playing with Charles in their yard. Brian wastes no time. He storms over to Addie's house and knocks on the door. Addie's wife answers, and Brian demands, "I need to see Addie." She shakes her head. He's not home. But Brian doesn't believe her. Pushing past her, he finds Addie inside, watching Charles struggle under heavy labor. Addie is forcing Charles to do all sorts of difficult tasks, treating him like nothing more than a machine. Charles looks exhausted and miserable. Brian rushes to him. "Charles, are you okay?" Charles, in a weak voice, responds, "I want to come back home." Brian's heart breaks, but he knows he can't just take Charles away. Addie is a powerful man, someone people fear, and Brian doesn't have the strength to fight him. Just then, Addie's daughters run into the room, giggling about the upcoming festival. Brian overhears them talking about how, at this festival, everyone burns things that trouble them. His stomach drops when he realizes what this means. Addie is planning to burn Charles. Horrified, Brian rushes back home with Hazel. He is devastated, but Hazel refuses to let him give up. "I'm proud of you, Brian," she says, trying to encourage him. "You made Charles, and we can't just let Addie destroy him. We have to fight back." Determined, they come up with a plan. Using whatever they can find, they build a weapon, a cabbage gun. It may be silly, but it's all they have. With newfound courage, they prepare themselves. Tomorrow night, they will face Addie and do whatever it takes to save Charles. The next night, Brian and Hazel go to the festival where people are burning things they want to leave behind. Addie arrives with Charles and places him among the burning belongings, ready to destroy him. But Brian, determined to save his friend, sneaks in and secretly rescues Charles. He rushes him to the car and speeds away. When Addie realizes Charles is gone, he flies into a rage and chases after them. As Brian and Charles drive, they apologize to each other, realizing that despite their arguments, they truly care for one another. Wanting to stop Addie, Brian tries to use his cabbage gun, but like most of his inventions, it fails. Addie catches up, forcing them to stop and dragging Charles back to the festival. Brian fights back, but Addie overpowers him. Just as things seem hopeless, Charles quickly repairs the cabbage gun and fires at Addie and his family, knocking them back with a powerful blast. Defeated and humiliated, Addie leaves with his family. The crowd cheers for Brian, finally recognizing his courage. The next morning, Brian and Charles sit together, enjoying their last moments. Then Brian reveals a special surprise, a world tour ticket for Charles. Excited, Charles prepares for his journey. At the train station, he hugs Brian and gives him and Hazel a drawing he made of them together. As the train departs, Charles waves goodbye, ready to explore the world. With that, the story ends, a heartfelt tale of friendship, adventure, and dreams coming true.